We are finishing today the stories of Jephthah, and I want to add a little bit on to what we finished with last week, which was his vow to make an offering of the first thing, the first difficult in English, came through the door, um, and of course his daughter. Many of you mentioned last week that there were parallels in Greek literature. Turns out there's parallels all over the world. And as I mentioned before, when it comes to stories that have that have parallels around the world, there's a number of ways to go about dealing with that or understanding that. My first exposure was, I think, in my second year of university. I had a course in folklore. And I was exposed to the Stith-Thompson volumes. If you studied folklore literature, you know what I'm talking about. It's an index of tales from around the world. And we were looking at, I think it was the flood story, right? So some of you know the flood story is an ancient Near Eastern literature before the time of the Bible, then afterwards, and then trying to decide what was influenced by, who influenced whom. And you get to certain islands in the Pacific and places like that where they have a flood story, which on one hand is understandable, but then you find that it's really similar to what we have in the Bible. So you always have to check to see from when are the testimonies of the story. Is it before or after Christianity got to those places? Okay. But once you have this collection of tales from around the world of places that are pre-Christianity, that is influenced by the Bible, Hebrew Bible, then you have to come up, you basically have two possibilities. One is that it really happened. And of course, there are those usually religious scholars that say, yes, of course, the world, humanity remembers it because it really happened. The other way of going about that is the approach that I've been taking for the last many, many decades. And that is, it reflects something very, very integral to the human condition. And that is our fear of drowning in water. Now, it could be that desert peoples don't have this story, although there's always a well to fall into, I guess, right, or a riverbed to get swept away and with a flash flood. But it reflects a human condition. Why am I dredging all this up now? Because when I take a look at all those traditions, and we could have done that for an entire hour, right? Just look at the various traditions around the world of the hero pledging something and it turning out to be his most dearest, his child. We could say, well, it's a story that's influenced other stories. So say the Bible got it from pre-biblical literature, and then it transferred across to Greek literature. We could go that way, or we could go the way that I prefer, is that it reflects something very, very basic to the human condition. And that is our stupid, stupid tendency to make vows, irresponsible vows when we're in trouble. We want to get out of it, and we pay dearly for that afterwards. And so the story, precautionary tales are hyperbolic by definition, right? But that's the tale we tell ourselves everywhere, human beings around the world, because we have this stupid tendency to keep doing it. And I mentioned last week the fact that the motif of the sacrifice of the son of Isaac, the binding of Isaac, is the absolute most common motif, most found motif in modern Hebrew poetry. Modern Hebrew poetry, far more than any other biblical motif. That says something as well to Israeli society. Our tendency to sacrifice that which is dear because of a vow that we've taken. There is a very precious tradition, midrashic tradition, about the sons of the Egyptians, the children of the Egyptians, that come to their parents and they say, after Moses has announced each of the plagues and it comes to fruition, they say, Moses says that we're all of us firstborn, we're going to be killed. And everything that he has said has come true. So just let them go. And the Midrash puts in the mouths of the Egyptians' parents, or the fathers, right? The Egyptians says, no, we won't let them go. In other words, not over my dead body, over your dead bodies, we're not going to let them go. And there, again, this quintessential characteristic of people that get dug into their own attitude of what needs to be, Romeo and Juliet stories, whatever it is across the spectrum of world literature, we have this motif of people that that, you know, all right, I think I've said enough when it comes to that. But I did want to share with you something which is missing from the Hebrew biblical account. And this is something, a tendency in apocryphal literature and also in pseudepigraphical literature, as we're going to look at now in the just a short passage from Pseudo Philo, who we've brought before, and that is later authors wanted to fill in the gaps. That's one of the things that a great scholar of Midrash, Yitzchak Heinemann, often taught and wrote about the things that the things that the rabbis like to do in Midrash. I've mentioned many times they hate anonymity, right? They don't want anonymity, so we're going to see an example of that today. They're always assigning somebody who's anonymous or unknown, say, oh, that's really so and so, right? To connect all the dots in this intertextuality of biblical literature. It's to fill the gaps, geographical gaps, knowledge gaps. Midrash does that. One of the things that Midrash does, likes to do, is to supply a prayer in a place where there should have been one, but there wasn't one. Especially when one example is when and so prayed, and then there's no, the so-and-so could be any biblical character, but there's no recollection in biblical text of the prayer itself. That's one way of filling in the gap. The other way is when so-and-so should have prayed, and it's not there. And that, for instance, we have in the additions to Esther from the book, from the Septuagint, from the Greek translation of Esther, which is a little bit larger than our book of Esther, just in the same way that Daniel is extra as well. In other words, filling in the gaps and supplying the prayer. Another rabbinic or a rabbinic source that does this often are the Aramaic translations, the ones that were said that kind of take a snapshot or a video of what was happening in the synagogue in the first few centuries of the Common Era, when the Torah was being translated into Aramaic, when people were listening to it in the public reading of the Torah in the synagogue, but they didn't understand Hebrew already. So the translator in Aramaic was giving them a rather generous, impregnated, embellished translation, you know, adding on a lot of things for the listeners' benefit, right? And taking out things as well. So here we have, let me share my screen a moment with something. It's not a great scan. It's just to give you an example. This is from Pseudo Philo, and you can see here and up at the top, the first paragraph at the top, and when the daughter of Yiftach came to Mount Stelach, right? Just gave a naming a place that is not named in the book of Judges itself. She began to weep, and this is her lamentation, that she lamented and wept over herself before she departed, and she said. And then we don't really have to read this here. I just wanted to bring it to you as an example of a poem which is put in the mouth of a character because according to the retelling of the story, it should have been there or it was there. And this is a common thing, and my guess is it's common around the world as well. Okay, so before we go on, I think it seems that you've been muted, everybody, because there was a little bit too much noise. There was an echo beforehand. But before we go on to our text, one more. There's one more text I wanted to share with you. Okay. There you go. It's the same page, but it's the bottom paragraph. This is how the story winds up in Pseudo Philo. And on saying these things, Seila, right? We didn't have her name in biblical literature. Somebody, again, we've got an echo from somebody. So if you're not speaking, please mute. But please say something if you want to say something. It's just that the echo is a problem. And so. Again, the later Midrash, although this is not officially rabbinic Midrash, likes to supply names for people who are anonymous. In this case, it's Bat Yiftach, the daughter of Yiftach, and somebody asked last week about what doesn't she have a name? Well, Pseudo Philo supplies the name Seila, and he did everything that he had vowed and offered the holocausts, which are multiple offerings, burnt offering. Holocaust originally means burnt offering, right? Then all the virgins of Israel gathered together and buried the daughter of Yiftach and wept for her. And the children of Israel made a great lamentation and established that in the month, on the 14th day of the month, they should come together every year and weep for Yiftach's daughter for 4 days. And they named her tomb in keeping with her name, Se'ilah. And Yiftach judged the sons of Israel 10 years, and he died and was buried with his fathers. And we're going to go back to, we're going to, this is, we're going to go to the actual end of the Yiftach story now on the sheet, but just to point out, her name was Se'ilah, and she's buried in a place or a tomb that's called Se'ilah. And that's just a telltale time of an etiological tale, which we mentioned, those that were studying yesterday together in the Torah class, about the fire pans that were hammered into a covering for the altar. It's something that people said, oh, what's this? Why? This is peculiar. This is strange. This is interesting. And then a story was produced to explain it. So my guess is there was an actual place at the time that this was written, let's say the end of the first millennia before the Common Era, the beginning of the very beginning of the Common Era. That's the name of the tomb was Se'ilah, and the story came, well, Se'ilah, oh, that's Yiftach's daughter, and so on and so forth. Now, it could be traditions that are lasting from the time for hundreds of years, from the time the Bible was written. We have no way of proving that, but that's kind of an open-ended question that my good friends and teachers, Avigdor Shenan and Yair Zakovich of Hebrew University, always like to say, if you find so much about so many midrashic traditions about a particular biblical passage that is that we feel is lacking, it's telegraphic in its style, then there's a chance that these were old oral traditions that were not written in the Hebrew Bible but survived somehow. Okay, before we go on to our sheet, any comments or questions? Okay, everybody's quiet today.
I'm trying to adjust it all.
Okay, so we're on our sheet now, Judges 12. And because your microphone's on and you're speaking already, Sid, why don't you go ahead and read verse number 1.
Okay. The men of Ephraim mustered and crossed the Jordan to Zaphon. They said to Yiftach, why did you march to fight the Ammonites without calling us to go with you? We'll burn your house down over you.
Okay, so this is the end of the Yiftach story. Remember, he had a great victory over the Ammonites because he made that vow. He came home, it's hinted at that he did what he needed to do. He killed his daughter, murdered or sacrificed his daughter. And then the story's not over. You think they would celebrate him as a hero, but instead the Ephraimites, they come with a complaint, with a kvetch. And if it sounds familiar, because it is familiar, they came to Gilad as well with the same kind of complaint. The difference is Gilad was very diplomatic, and his guy says, you know what, I should have called you. Take some of the spoils. What most commentators say here, what they're really concerned with is not, why didn't you let us help you? It's, if we were part of the battle, we would have gotten some of the spoils. So instead, that's the way Gilad dealt with it. But Yiftach is going to deal with it differently. But before that, though, what is the threat? We'll burn down your house. Sound familiar, anybody? Burning down houses?
No.
We had it a few weeks ago.
Yeah.
Already maybe more than a month ago. I lose track of how long the time was. With no, after Yotam's, it's part of Yotam's fable, but who was it? Avimelech, right? Avimelech, he set fire to the people of Shechem.
Oh yeah, he burned their houses.
Burned the house down. But there's also a scene like this that was coming up in the stories of Samson. By the way, as of next week, we'll be dealing with Samson. That's going to take us a while because there's a lot of material there, and arguably the most colorful, interesting part of the book of Judges. But that's next week. So there's the same thing there. There's the burning down of houses. When you think of the fact that we don't know about reality, but at least from a literary point of view, it's a common motif. We'll do what we want, or we'll burn down your house. Okay. Now, Sid, who has a birthday tomorrow? You or Sid or Sue?
Sid,
Sid. I
So-
had the first one.
So
No,
Sid, happy birthday.
birthday one.
Oh, my birthday is tomorrow.
I know, so happy birthday. I
Oh,
wasn't
thank
sure
you.
if it was one of you. Okay, happy birthday. All right.
Rabbi's correlation between what you're talking about burning down the house and the bombings that have been taking place in Gaza, where at least the Israelis have warned, we're coming in 5 minutes to get out, we're going to burn your house down, basically.
Yeah, I'm careful about making that kind of an analogy. On one hand, one wants to say that's great. The Israeli army is being more ethical in the fact that giving people a chance to leave. And by the way, that is a theme that's also in the book of Joshua. That in many of the case, or the rabbinic understanding of the book of Joshua was before conquering each of the cities, Joshua sent them a chance to leave, peacefully give up and leave. And so that's probably a better analogy, because Ephraim wanting to burn down the house, that's out of greed or jealousy. I mean, there's no strategic advantage to burning down his house, military advantage. That's why I wouldn't make the analogy, right? Now, where would I make an analogy? Something that I had to be the first politically, well, I should say the first political, when it comes to the occupation, thing that I needed to do, where it brought home to me the problematics, is when I was in the army. I remember I was Orthodox, I was a yeshiva army student together, and we were assigned one night in the middle of the night to form, in English, what do you call, a perimeter, to make a perimeter because the army was coming up and sealing up a house of somebody who had been accused, not convicted, but accused of terrorism. It was in an area not far from Jerusalem, one of the outskirts, like it's where the wall passes right now. I remember exactly where it was, and we were out there with our guns, making a circle, thinking as I'm a tankist, right? I know how to use this huge cannon, but with my M16 or whatever we had, I guess we had M16s at the time. We're out there, and I'm not a foot soldier, but it was a precaution. And then realizing that this is a form of collective punishment. In other words, it's a deterrent, Rob. It's a deterrent that the Israeli army or occupational forces have said for years, if you participate in any terrorism, please, somebody, if you're not speaking, okay. If you participate in any kind of terrorism, not only will we punish you, we will seal off or destroy the home of your family. Another form of collective punishment. And I think to me, that's a better analogy, I think. Yeah. Although the whole problem at the end here, I think it's more about not getting part of the, not getting the spoils. And then I'll speak to it in a second, but this has to do with Yiftach's quality of leadership as well. Okay.
Thank you.
So Sue, do you want to read 2 to 3, please?
Yeftah answered them, I and my people were in a better conflict with the Ammonites, and I summoned you, but you did not save me from them. When I saw that you were no savior, I risked my life and advanced against the Ammonites, and the Lord delivered them into my hands. Why have you come here now to fight against me?
In other words, I didn't call you because you proved yourselves that you're useless. You weren't going to help. I went ahead and did it. Instead of thanking me for saving the day for you, you guys are accusing me now, right? And this is different than Gilad placated them when they said, "Why haven't you?" and let them share in the spoils. But Yiftach's answer, or his reaction, is quite different. The next section is verse is one long verse. It's 4. Rob, why don't you read?
And Jephthah gathered all the men of Gilead and fought the Ephraimites. The men of Gilead defeated the Ephraimites, for they had said, "You Gileads are nothing but fugitives from Ephraim. Being Manasseh is like being in Ephraim.
Yeah, so this is a complicated thing. I remember, now I remember I promised maps last week and did not prepare them. But this is all what's happening on the east bank of the Jordan River. And it's a lot of intertribal tension, which seems to be present with so many of the stories about the tribes of Israel, the 2.5 tribes of Israel that settled on the other side. That was a change in the original plan that happens already in the book of Numbers that we'll get to in a few weeks in our Wednesday study, a few weeks from now. And it seems like there's just so much reflected that are they in, are they out, are they with us, they're not with us. And it wasn't the original plan. The original plan was for the promised land to be up into the Jordan, not on the other side. So this is a reflection of that. And I've kind of chosen not to go into that other than to say, again, that Yiftach's choice of leadership here is not to de-escalate, but to escalate. His choice is to escalate and say, you know what? Screw you guys. Let's go to war. And then comes this next particular scene, which many of you will find familiar. Perhaps you didn't know that this is the scene, but Dan, why don't you read the next section for us, 5 to 6.
The Gileadites held the fords of the Jordan against the Ephraimites. And when any fugitive from Ephraim said, "Let me cross," the men of Gilead would ask him, "Are you an Ephraimite?" If he said no, they would say to him, "Then say Shibolet." And he would say Sibolet, not being able to pronounce it correctly. Thereupon, they would seize him and slay him by the fords of the Jordan. 42,000 Ephraimites fell at that time.
Wow.
So
Wow.
the famous Shibolet, which created a term called Shibolet that's used in English that many people don't know relates to the story. Shibolet is two possibilities. The most common, first of all, it's clear that they're using the word Shibolet because of the sh kind of speech difference in dialect, or in whatever the word is in pronunciation. Dialect may refer just to the words, but whatever it is, the proper term isn't when it comes to pronunciation. So there's two major meanings for that word. The most common is the sheaves of a plant that has things like, wheat, grain, things like that. That she like the song for those who are folk dancers. Shibolet basadeh, the sheaves in the field. But then you ask if they're crossing over the ford, then what does that have to do? They're in the middle of the water. Well, there's another meaning, which is in Psalms, and it may only be once in Psalms, I don't remember, and that is the swirl of water. What would that be called? The swirl of water, like in
Whirlpool?
kind of like that. Yeah, kind of something like that. And then they could say, what do you call that? They don't say Shibolet, right? Which they could perhaps make them say, they could pretend to say Shibolet instead of Sibolet, but it makes more sense. And this is something, this was in my first year at the university, that our language teacher, our biblical Hebrew and biblical Aramaic, 2 separate classes, which were some of the more boring classes that I have, but I actually learned a lot, was he says, he can imagine them being at the ford and say, what are you looking at? What's that right there? And if they said Sibolet, they're the enemy. If they said Shibolet, they're the good guys. Hold on just a second. I want to get a book.
Unknown caller.
So this is a book that I told you I wanted to consult last week, and I was on the road unexpectedly. I guess it's an academic. You could call it an academic work. They didn't think highly of it so much at Hebrew University, but it's just a lovely index going through the Hebrew Bible with parallels from other literature. That's how I know about the Yiftach stories. But there's an interesting parallel here on the topic of Shibolet. And so one of the examples he brings is when the English defeated the Danes on St. Bryce's Day. Richard, did you know that November 13th is St. Bryce's Day? Richard, I expect you to know these things. In any case, in the year 1002, so fugitive enemies were detected by being made to utter the words Chichester Church, right? Isn't there like a Leonard Bernstein symphony at Chichester Church, I think?
He was commissioned by the rector of Chichester Cathedral. And the interesting thing is that it contains outtakes from West Side Story. The rector said, I want it to be just like should sound just like West Side Story because I'm a big fan. And Lenny said, well, you're in luck. Here's some musical snippets that didn't make it into West Side Story. So I think it's Lama Ragashu Hagoyim. Yeah, actually that's it. Lama Ragashu Hagoyim should have been in West Side Story, but is in Chichester Psalms.
Well, thank you. David Friedman is always good for an interesting musical anecdote. I listened to Chichester Psalms when was it last year when I was doing Psalm Springs, the podcast, and we thought of doing something with Stanley. Actually, I with Rhonda's partner Stanley, who's a composer. We actually recorded something, but it needs a lot of editing, and didn't seem there was much interest. In any case, 2020 years ago, exactly almost, in November 13th, it'll be 2020 years ago, they were asked to say Chichester Church, which they mispronounced as Chichester Church. And that's about as similar to the Shibolet that you get. That's kind of interesting. Now again, did that really happen? Or did the tellers of the story, did they base that on the story from Judges? There are other examples here that you give which are not nearly as good. But that became a term in English, a shibboleth, right? And nothing I've ever used, but has anybody ever used that in their own language, using the word shibboleth?
It's the name of an academic search engine. I used it, yeah, during my theology studies, yeah, to search for articles and stuff like that. It was, yeah.
Cool.
It appeared in some novel that I read, because I remember looking it up in the dictionary because I didn't know what it meant, and so some highfalutin snooty author used it to tell everybody how smart he or she was, but I don't remember the book I read it in.
Okay, just I need to make a comment about the background you have today. Is that because of we were learning the story of Korach?
You mean the koi pond?
Oh, it looks, you can't see the water. Now I can see the koi pond. You were blocking the fish. All I could see, it looked like an empty hole in your backyard.
Oh, no.
Looked like
No. It's the koi pond in front of my house.
Because the Korach story that we did last week. Okay. All right then. Good. So, were any comments or, well, let's take a look. Dan, why don't you read what Rabbi David Radak has to say about Shibolet Sibolet?
Okay, Shibolet, just as they would test them with this word, so too they would test them with every word that has a shin in it. And the Ephratites would read it as sin. And the text chose one of the words. And some say that he chose the word Shibolet because there was a flowing stream, Shibolet Nahar, in the place where the Ephraimites were crossing, who would stutter on the letter shin. Maybe the climate of their land was a factor. This is like the people of France who do not understand how to read shin and read it like a weak ta.
Okay, so for those of you that don't have a background in Hebrew, reading Hebrew language, the same letter shin, which is, it's kind of shaped like the top of a pitchfork. If in a vocalized text, that is text with dots with vowels, if the dot is at the upper left-hand corner, it's pronounced sin, sa. And if it's in the upper right-hand corner, it's pronounced sha. They're essentially the same letter when it comes to, from a linguistic point of view. Now, it could be that they reflect a different root beforehand, and there's an interchange between sin and samech. We don't need to do that today, but there's also the aspect that some of you grew up, like Sid, I know did, learned Hebrew in the Ashkenazic pronunciation, the traditional Ashkenazic pronunciation, and that is when you have a tav, which is the last letter which we all pronounce ta, like a T. If it has a dot in it, it's a hard T. If it doesn't have a dot inside of it, then originally it was, in Yemenites pronounce it tha, which is similar to other Semitic, like Arabic as well. There's a tha, and Ashkenazim pronounce it sa. So what would be the classic example for those of you, perhaps even the non-Jews? The Kaddish begins in an Ashkenazic pronunciation, Yiskadal v'Yiskadash, as opposed to the way that I learned Hebrew when I was a kid, and the way we speak Hebrew in the state of Israel is Yitkadal v'Yitkadash. Right, same letter, different pronunciations. And what I like most, and the reason I really brought Radak is because, I think I've covered all the material until now, is that he says maybe the climate in their land was a factor. Their speaking pronunciation. So Sister Claire, since you are our French representative now, what would you say? Would you say the climate has anything to do with how French is pronounced in different places of France?
I mean, it's sort of like the southeast of France is known for having a very kind of particular accent. Yeah, and there's all sorts of jokes around that about it being, warm and French Riviera and all that kind of stuff. Yeah.
So Rabbi David Kimchi is with good standing, right? He was in Provence, so.
Yeah, there you go. That's exactly
okay.
right.
And Sasha and I are watching now this Swedish series, which is in English called The Restaurant, Vartid är nu, Our Time Is Now in Swedish. And compared to other Swedish programs that we've watched in movies, I'm able to follow a lot of this Swedish because it takes place in Östermalm, in the high society, in the area where we live, where the rabbinic flat in Stockholm was. But of course, there's other people in the characters that are from Skåne, which is the southern part, or from Denmark. And I can't, and we've watched other series like that are from Skåne, like The Bridge, between Denmark and I can't understand a word what they're saying. So I get the pronunciation. And the truth is, I've met people in this country as well that come from places in the deep south that I'm not exactly sure what they're saying either. But that's me. Okay.
You may have just explained. I had a question all these years that all the bar and bat mitzvahs growing up as a child in Michigan, when we would chant before the Torah reading, Notein HaTorah. I had one cousin that always said Nosein HaTorah.
Right.
So maybe, yeah.
Exactly. So Baruch es Adonai, and it's not only the sa and the ta, it's also Adonai as opposed to Adonai. So there are a number of changes. Yeah, but so I guess that's how. Yeah. All right. So enough said. Any other questions or comments about this lovely little detail here about Shibolet? Okay, then. So Sister Claire, would you read verse 7? And this is the end of the Yiftach tale.
Yiftach led Israel 6 years. Then Yiftach the Gilead died, and he was buried in one of the towns of Gilead.
Okay. It's interesting because 6 years doesn't seem like a lot of time to do all the stuff that he did. But that's the biblical account. On the other hand, the Septuagint here, the Greek translation, which may very well reflect a different ur-text, a different Hebrew that it was translated from 2,200 years ago, has 60 years. And that would make it align with some of the other prophets here. You can choose either way. One of the interesting things here is the way that, and this was hinted at last week in something we read in rabbinic literature. Where was he buried?
In one of the towns.
Well, the Hebrew is Vayikaver, and he was buried be Arei Gilad, and that is technically in the cities. Now, it doesn't say, but that's not, the Hebrew is technically, the literal translation is in the cities of Gilad, which probably means in that territory. There's these areas, that's where he was buried, in that area, that region. But the rabbis had a field day on this because Yiftach was not popular amongst the rabbis. I mean, dude, he killed his daughter, right? He offered his daughter. So how could you leave that up in the air? So he had to be punished somehow. Well, there's no punishment here in the book of Judges, unless you say he was buried in different cities. His body was dismembered. His bones were spread into different places. That's how he was disrespected in a disrespectful way. And yeah, so again, the rabbis wanting to teach a lesson that is in line with what they teach, and not letting a character get off the hook so easily for sacrificing his own child.
The RA means in the section or in the area.
No, an ear is a city, and or a town. Arim is the plural. So Ara is the construct of Ara Gilad, in the cities of, or the villages of.
Oh, okay.
But it's that's idiomatically in the cities of is just another way of saying in the region of.
In the region of, yeah.
There are other words for region that weren't used here. That's
Okay.
how rabbis were able to pick up on this. Okay, you'll excuse me one moment. I want to pull up a text from the Babylonian Talmud. All right, we'll do it later. Okay, so let's go. Who do we have? Wayne, would you like to read? John, would you like to read for us? I'm sorry, Wayne. No, Wayne. Yes, Wayne.
After him is men of Bethlehem, led Israel. He had 30 sons, and he married off 30 daughters outside the clan, and brought in 30 girls from outside the clan for his sons. He led Israel 7 years. Then Ibzan died and was buried in Bethlehem.
Okay, so we're gonna we will now go to Josephus, but so these are, remember we had these minor judges beforehand, before we had the Yiftach story. There were 3 of them, Tola and others, and very little is actually said about them. But so here we've got, and this is it, right? Interesting thing of talking about marrying outside. It means he's spreading his influence. That's it. There may have been, probably were other stories about Ibzan, but are not mentioned here. As you'll see in a section I'll call up, the rabbis understood that Ibzan was, because he doesn't, how can we just leave it at that? Because he was from Beit Lechem, from Bethlehem, he must have been Boaz. Ibzan, Boaz, that's a little bit similarity in assonance. And but most commentators, I think, would say, because these judges are all from the north, it's not talking about the Bethlehem of Judah, right? There's Bethlehem in Judah, Beit Lechem Yehuda, but there's also Beit Lechem HaGlili. Even today, there's a Bethlehem which is up near Haifa in the Galil. It's a common place name, just like there were a number of Gilgals, there were a number of Bethlehems. Bethlehem meaning the house of plenty, the house of food. Okay, so why don't we skip down now, Wayne? If you could read the first section. Well, why don't you go ahead and read? No, I'm sorry. We'll do that afterwards. I apologize. Go ahead and read the next section though, 11, 12.
After him, Elon, Zebulunite, led Israel for 10 years. Then Elon, the Zebulunite, died and was buried in Ajalon, the territory of Zebulun.
Okay, so you can see this is up in the northern part, northern tribes. Again, there's even less information about Elon. Elon can be it can be either mean a oak tree, Elon, sturdy, right? Iftzan, I don't know of any meaning for Iftzan that could mean. The previous one, say Elon. And where is he buried? It can also mean, by the way, a small ram. And he's buried in a place, or deer, or a hart, deer, not a ram. Well, they're both, then they're kind of interchangeable in biblical literature. And he was buried in a place called Ayalon. So there's a little play on words there. Elon was buried in Ayalon. Some of you know that may recognize the name Ayalon. It's the name of the main freeway that goes right through Tel Aviv. Kfish Ayalon, the Ayalon. And that's because there's a river that's called the Ayalon that used to, for many years, now it's kind of sorted out, but used to flood Tel Aviv. It's in the lower parts of Tel Aviv, which are kind of in that whole area. And yeah, anyway, so there was a river called the Ayalon. Okay, but that's not where this is. This is all taking place in the north. And then why don't you do the last two sections for us, Wayne?
After him, Abdon, son of Hillel, the Parathonite, led Israel. He had 40 sons and 30 grandsons who rode on 70 jackasses. He led Israel for 8 years. Then Abdon, son of Hillel, the Parathonite, died. He was buried in Pirathon in the territory of Ephraim on the hill of the Amalekites.
Okay, so the same thing, not a lot about this guy. We've got the 40 sons and the 30 grandsons, which is a little bit interesting. Usually we'd expect there to be more grandsons than sons themselves, and they're riding on jackasses or on colts. Remember, we had that before with Yerubal's sons, I think it was, as well. It's a sign of aristocracy to ride on these donkeys. So these three minor judges, we don't have a lot about them, here and there a little bit, but we'll see that that Josephus, that is early, what I would say early Midrash, he knows to tell a little bit more about these tales. And why don't I ask you, Trudy, to read the first paragraph in Josephus?
Just a quick question. How
Sure.
is it explained that these men had 30 and 40 children? Did they practice polygamy, or did wives die and they had new wives, or were they from slaves?
Yeah, it's always from multiple wives, right? There is so polygamy is not a dirty word when it comes to the Bible, right? Not only is polygamy not a dirty word, but even incestual polygamy, marrying two sisters, as Jacob did, is not a dirty word in biblical literature. It becomes somewhat frowned upon, but it's not forbidden in rabbinic literature. And it wasn't until 1,020 years ago that Rabbeinu Gershom issued a number of edicts. One of the edicts was that, and it was binding on all those living in Ashkenaz, that for 1,000 years you couldn't marry more than one woman. It didn't apply, for instance, to Yemen, which had a different Jewish culture, and therefore there were Yemenite Jews that were brought to Israel by the Jewish Agency, the State of Israel, in the late 40s, early 50s, and there were cases of having more than one wife, two wives. I've met people from those families before, and if coming from again, unless you know, not Mormons, but those that are the extreme, I don't know if we'd call them extreme Mormons, but those Mormons or those people in that part of the spectrum, religious spectrum, that do polygamy. I mean, I never came into contact with any people like that. I never met them personally, and if you did, I'm not sure it would be known. Perhaps in Utah it is, I don't know. So it was always quite peculiar to meet the grandchildren of, yes, my grandfather had two wives. Really? And yeah, it's perfectly fine from a Jewish point of view. Yeah. Okay. So yes. And then of course there were concubines or servants that helped out, to the round numbers, of course, are suspect, right? You know what, it sounds too idyllic. But let's go now, Trudy, to Josephus. The first, this is Josephus ending up this part of the book of Judges. Go ahead.
Now when Yiptath, was dead, Ibzan took the government, being of the tribe of Judah and of the city of Bethlehem. He had 60 children, 30 of them sons and the rest daughters, all of which he left alive behind him, giving the daughters in marriage to husbands and taking wives for his sons. He did nothing in the 7 years of his administration that was worth recording or deserved a memorial. So he died an old man and was buried in his own country.
So you got to like that editorial comment by Josephus. He was a good for nothing. He did nothing, but you know what? That's why is the book of Judges silent? Because he didn't do anything. He was a do nothing president, if you want to go in that direction. And I thought, because we like to draw the connections between or I like to draw the connections between this and modern day Israel, I thought of going back to find the prime ministers who nobody knows the names of, and to say, no, there were prime ministers that really didn't do much, but there aren't that many. I mean, we kind of know, maybe it's hard for me to be objective because I lived there, but I mean, Ehud Olmert was not a long, terribly meaningful prime minister, although he's probably more famous because he went to jail for corruption. Ehud Barak kind of stayed on the scene for a long time and was the head of the Israeli army for many years before then. Paris, of course, and Rabin of blessed memory, all of them, they're well known. Shamir, maybe people don't know so much Shamir because he was not a bombastic figure. Shamir was close to Bey. He was he inherited Begun, and he was. Those were difficult times, at least for those of us on the left. But Shamir is interesting because Shamir, if I understand correctly, was the Irgun operative who assassinated. I just mentioned this to somebody in an email. Bernadetta. What's Bernadetta's first name? With an F.
Yeah, Bernadette.
He was the UN's emissary to Jerusalem in 1947, 48. He was assassinated by the Etzeler, by the Lehi, one of the revisionist groups, and it was Shamir who did it. So an assassin went on to be the prime minister of Israel. Those are interesting things, but there wasn't a lot of things that happened under him. So I don't know if it's a good analogy or not, but I like the way that Josephus, or it's interesting how Josephus frames his explanation as to why there's no really interesting stories about him in this particular book.
Is there? I think that it's not necessarily a bad thing that there is nothing to report if the people lived in peace for 10 years.
Yeah, that is true, unless of course you are a military man and you want to be able to report great battles that were won, as Josephus was a military man.
Yeah.
Okay, Trudy, why don't you go on the next one?
Okay. When Ibzan was dead after this manner, neither did Elon, who succeeded him in the government and kept it 10 years, do anything remarkable. He was of the tribe of Zebulun.
Okay, go ahead.
Abdon, also the son of Hillel of the tribe of Ephraim, and born at the city Pirathon, was ordained their supreme governor after Helon. He is the only recorded to have been happy in his children. For the public affairs were then so peaceable and in such security that neither did he perform any glorious action. He had 40 sons, and by them left 30 grandchildren. And he marched in state with these 70, who were all very skillful in riding horses, and he left them all alive after him. He died an old man and obtained a magnificent burial in Pirathon.
Okay, so again, just to round out how Josephus supplies the missing information. It was too scarce. He could have skipped over it. Josephus does skip over things, but I think it was important for Josephus to bring and this in general is important for modern day Zionism as well. It was important for him to bring examples of military prowess, or to criticize when there wasn't any, because that was his MO, and that was his job, his self-appointed job of explaining Judaism to the non-Jewish population of Rome at the time. So give me a second. There's one more. See if we can put this. So I'm just going to read it because I can't find it. I was going to project it on the screen, but I only found this morning that I came across this this rabbinic tradition in the Talmud that talks about Boaz and Ibzan. So you'll just have to listen to me read. I'm sorry. Rabbah, the son of Rav Huna, said in the name of Rav, Ibzan is Boaz, something that I mentioned beforehand. Boaz prepared for his sons 120 wedding banquets. For it says, and he, Ibzan, had 30 sons, and he sent out 30 daughters. He brought 30 daughters for his wives from without. And okay, he judged Israel for 7 years. And for each of his 60 children, he made 2 feasts, one on their betrothal and one on their marriage, which was the rabbinic custom to have 2 different ceremonies. One in his own house and one in the house of his in-laws. To none of these feasts did he invite Manoach, eventually Samson's father. This is a bridge to the next section we're going to do next week, because he said, how could this barren mule, talking about Manoach who had no children, how could this barren mule ever pay me back? So in punishment, all of his 60 children died during his lifetime. And this is what is meant by the popular saying, if you had 60 children, but they all died in your lifetime, what good were they? That's a popular saying, right? Marry again and father one that will be more stalwart than the 60. That's quoted from as a common saying. So all I want to say is that the rabbis, one last thing that they did before we end at least what I've prepared for today, the juxtaposition of stories. In this way, they connected the Ibzan story, Ibzan Boaz, which is almost at the end of this section of Judges, to the next big section, which begins with Manoach, Samson's father, whose wife was barren. Another character, by the way, who we will learn to admire, but also find out she has no name other than the wife of Manoach, Manoach's wife. Okay, questions or comments for today on anything we've done?
I'm wondering in the Josephus, the last bit that we did here. So the last guy, he gets a magnificent burial, even though he did nothing. What's up with that? The others,
I don't know. That's a good question. Did he have other material that he was drawing from Josephus, oral traditions? We don't know.
Okay.
It could be how he was presented. I don't know. He's maybe there's a certain stature because he's presented as the son of somebody. Mostly, it's not just the Ibzan was by himself, but here he is, Avdon, son of Hillel.
Okay.
By the way, it shows you this name Hillel is an older name. It's not just the Hillel of the rabbis, not just a Jewish student union in contemporary America, and not just the name of one of our grandsons.
Rabbi,
Yes.
I think he lives in Tel Aviv, I'm not sure. I have a cousin whose name is Alon with an A instead of.
So Alon pronounced that way is an oak tree.
Yeah, we've teased him a lot.
Right. Okay, good.
Rabbi,
Yes.
all these transitions of power just happened. Is there any understanding of how that happened? Because they came from different places?
No, and that's something we're going to want to talk about when we finish the book of Judges. Take a step back and say, so what have we had? Now, Mahayalanu, we say in Hebrew, right? What do we just do? What do we? And Zakovich and others will say that the whole point of these sporadic tales of, here a little bit and here a little bit and here's some success, a lot of failure, success, failure, was all in order to prepare the way for the Israelites to understand, you know what, we need a king, right? We need one central, we need a federal government. All these 13 colonies, they're doing whatever they want, different laws. We need to create a federal government. I just made an analogy that I actually have no knowledge of whatsoever other than what I learned in 6th grade. Okay.
Good analogy. It's a good analogy. The Articles of Confederation didn't work, and the king was Washington.
There you go.
That's a good analogy.
Yeah.
Okay.
Good analogy in American history. I've read the Constitutional Convention, and that's basically what happened.
All right. Anybody else, friends? Dan, you got any wisdom for us today?
Nothing today, thank you.
Not today. Okay. Gail
Oh,
Cantor, how you doing?
I just wanted to say, in the yeshiva, we learned about Rabbi Gershon. He had 2 wives, and one wife was older, one wife was younger. And the older wife would pull out all his black hairs, and the younger wife would pull out all his gray hairs. And then he says, hey, this is crazy. No more than one wife from now on.
So what you've done, Sid, is you kind of conflated 2 things. And the thing about the story about the pulling out the hairs, that's actually from the Talmud, which is
Really?
before, and it is the explanation of the common phrase in Hebrew, Yotzei karech mikan umikan, somebody who comes out bald in both directions, because the younger wife wanted him to only have black hair with no gray hairs. The older wife wanted him to only have gray hairs. In the end, both of his wives pulled out all of his hair. It's a saying that's used when you try to please everybody and you ended up pleasing nobody.
Right.
So Gail, how you doing? Everything all right?
Yes, I just unmuted myself. I am doing very well. Thank you. I have my Charleston, South Carolina family coming in a couple of weeks. So, yeah.
So ask them if they can say Shibolet.
That
I will.
reminds me of like during World War II, when the Germans dressed up a lot of the German soldiers in American uniforms and tried to infiltrate, and the Americans started using like, oh, who are the Brooklyn Dodgers, or who did they beat, and what, questions like that. Shibboleth.
Okay, and Sister Claire, how are things in France these days with the pandemic? Have things beginning to open up?
Yeah, yesterday there was a big easing of restrictions. It's not fully opened up, but yesterday was kind of a big day. So it's kind of mixed emotions, because there's a lot of resistance to being vaccinated here. Like the French are just very skeptical about it, and so kind of the fear is that people are gonna just go full out now that things have lifted a bit, and that things will pick up again, like virus wise. So we'll see, but we're able to welcome a little bit in Taizé, which is good, but with a lot of precautions and a lot of restrictions, of course. Yeah.
Is it Sister Claire? I was going to tell her, I was watching on TV last night, they were interviewing some Yahoo, it was a Yahoo, but she was convinced that if you get the vaccine, she was asking at a town forum, that it magnetizes you, and if you get the vaccine, spoons and forks and knives will stick to you. So you should warn everybody in France that that's a possibility.
Okay.
And they really won't want to do it. They really won't want to get vaccinated.
With those
Just think of
words,
this way, you could go into a restaurant with all your flatware.
with those words of Richardian wisdom, we say goodbye today, and see you. Have a good weekend, and see you Shabbat, or see you next week. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye, everybody.